This is a Parsha podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to the Matan podcast. The Vayikra series will focus on the lived experience of mitzvah observance, but I'm suspending my official series introduction until our next episode that will air immediately after Pesach about the mitzvah and details of tzarat, of leprosy. This week we'll be reading Parshat Tzav, and it coincides with Erev Pesach. So we bring you an episode that speaks about sacrifices and Pesach, namely the Korban Pesach in all of its glory. Before turning to today's conversation, I want to remind you that sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. Be in touch with us at podcast@matan.org.il or with the Matan office to sponsor one of our future Vayikra episodes. Today I have the pleasure of sitting down again with returning guest Rabbi Yitzchak Blau, who is Rosh Yeshivat Oraita and also teaches at Midreshet Lindenbaum. He is an associate editor of Tradition, the Journal of Jewish Thought, and the author of Fresh Fruit and Vintage Wine, The Ethics and Wisdom of the Agadah, and has published many articles on Jewish thought. Rabbi Blau, it's a pleasure to have you back in the podcast.
It is great to be here.
And I'm really excited to speak about this parak, this chapter in the book of Shemot. I've mentioned before on earlier episodes on this, it's one of my favorite ones in all of the book of Shemot because it has this amazing combination of the story that we're supposed to tell of Yetziat Mitzrayim and also the details of what we're supposed to do in these mitzvot. Earlier this year in our Shemot episodes, I sat with Rachel Sharansky-Danziger and we spoke about the first principle of storytelling, and we focused actually on this parak. So for those who want more insight into this parak specifically, I recommend going back to that earlier episode. But today we're going to be speaking about the Korban Pesach and the details that are provided, which are many and also multiple times. And I'm sure we'll get to that. But I'd love for you to sort of take it from there. What elements you want to sort of highlight within this idea of the Korban Pesach?
Okay, so I think this is an important chapter to analyze for two reasons. One, I think for a lot of us, we find easy meaning in the narratives of Tanakh, but might not find as much meaning in the halachic portions, particularly if they're detailed. We kind of wonder what's the meaning of this detail or the other detail. And this chapter is actually a great lens through which to explore that, how to find meaning in the details. In particular, I would say the fact that it's a korban is even more helpful. Because I think for a lot of us, okay, so if we're dealing with the human social interaction of monetary law, we see why it's meaningful. Mm-hmm. But we're less clear about various details regarding the korbanot. And here we have Korban Pesach as a test case. Just the third thing I'll add, besides details and korbanot, we also have a distinction that's interesting, that according to the Mishnah, and I think it is rooted in the Psukim, some of the details of the first Korban Pesach, what's called Pesach Mitzrayim, do not exist for all generations, for Pesach Dorot. Mm-hmm. So a third question to throw into the mix is, why are there discrepancies? What was unique about that first Pesach in Egypt?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important piece. I think it also underscores our general question about korbanot, which sort of always hovers over us in any conversation that we have in the book of Vayikra of, even if they're going to be resurrected tomorrow, what is the meaning that we're going to find in them? And while we're not going to go too deep into that conversation, and we had an episode last week that sort of again touched upon all those questions of what's the purpose of it, but it also is underscored. And I hope later in the conversation we'll also get to this piece about what are we going to take with us about all these details for a sacrificial system in a world that we're not bringing that in. So we'll save that for later, but there's all these sort of meta questions that hover over us as we're going to go get into the details.
Okay, so let's start with one detail. So you probably know from your Seder night that the Korban Pesach was meant to be roasted, tzli and not mevushal. And the Psukim don't give any indication what the purpose of that would be. Why is tzli somehow more appropriate than mevushal? Why do we want to roast it? And the commentators give a few different answers. So I'll mention, perhaps if I can, briefly three of them, one which I think is particularly significant. So the Rashbam thinks that it's all about haste, that we're trying to do things quickly. And indeed, there is a concept of chipazon regarding that first Pesach. And he says correctly that, when you cook something on an open fire, it cooks more quickly than if you cook it in water. So roasting is faster than cooking. So there is a sense of haste. I'll just point out one very interesting thing, if the Rashbam is right. Chipazon is actually one of the details that is limited to Pesach Mitzrayim. We don't say you have to eat b'chipazon afterward, but if the Rashbam is correct, there might be some lingering traces of chipazon for other generations also, that we do certain things to create haste. Some of the other details Rashbam also thinks is about the speed of performance.
Your hand, okay.
Sorry. So that would be one. Okay, the Chizkuni, and here I'm not going to get into great depth, but he assumes what many traditional writers assume, that the animals in question were somehow deities in Egyptian mythology or theology, and therefore there's a theological polemic going on, that we are literally killing their gods. And what he says, which I find it a little bit humorous, he says, I'll use an example from my backyard. So those who have like joint backyards, you might notice that if you ever have a barbecue, somehow the neighbors smell it and come over and check out what's happening. But if you cook in wood or so, there's no wafting smell that invites the entire block. Yeah. Okay, so indeed, so there's something public about roasting due to the odor generated. So the Chizkuni thinks that this makes it a more public statement. Like, we are not afraid of you, the Egyptians who used to be our masters. We can even slaughter what you mistakenly think is a god in a public forum. Okay, so those are very interesting. But I am particularly intrigued by the Sefer HaChinuch. Now, he makes a sociological assumption, which I don't know exactly what the basis is, but it leads in a very interesting direction. Yosef, and maybe you know why, actually. The Chinuch assumes that the nobility are the ones that eat roasted meat, as opposed to the common man. I don't know exactly why that's true. Okay. But if we go with that assumption...
Also, remind me what he's assuming that the nobility ate like that in Egypt?
Oh, I'm not sure, actually.
Okay.
Let's see what his formulation is. He just says, Shekain kach derech b'nei melachim v'sarim le'achol basar tzli. Okay. It is the way of, the families of kings and officials to eat roasted meat. But I think where it goes is really interesting, because it turns out that the B'nai Chorin theme of Pesach night might be needed to reinterpret it, or an element added. Meaning, we tend to think we're free people and not slaves. Certainly that's very important. But what if there's actually a second theme, or an added layer, where we're not just free people, but we're meant to feel like we're nobility, we're aristocracy, we have like a special mission in this world. And that would be very interesting. I think it would change our sense of what B'nai Chorin is. So if the Chinuch is right about the roasted meat, again, I don't know the basis, but if he's right, we certainly have pointing towards that theme. And I'll just point out that the Rambam in the Perush HaMishnayot, when he talks about Haseba, are reclining, his formulation is quite striking. I think Rabbi Meish Tergen first pointed this out to me. He says, Kederech she'ochlin ha'malachim v'ha'gdolim. So that we eat the way the kings and the great ones do, so that it should be freedom. Now, he does say freedom at the end, but he certainly threw in kingship. Yeah. So maybe Pesach night, we're generating a sense of nobility and not just a sense of freedom.
So two thoughts in response. First is that Kasuto says on this piece that, and it kind of throws a wrench into some of these theories, but that ancient Egyptian sacrifices were eaten raw. And so he looks, again, he never exactly quotes where he's taking these sources from, which is a slight issue sometimes. But this highlights very clearly why it has to, meaning being cooked is the chidush. It's not that the kind of cooking, which is fascinating. I love the smell piece, by the way. By the way, there's also an element of time, right? Like it cooks faster in that way. But he says that it's because all of the stipulations about the korban are to come and do something different with a korban that he says also was given in this time of the year, okay, that there was some sort of Pesach-like sacrifice that was given, and everything that we do is to completely upend what was customary then. So that's how he understands the cooking. It's not the kind of cooking, but it's cooked at all, which is an interesting piece. I don't exactly know where to place all of it, if one's true or not true. But the piece about the...
Can I respond to the
Yeah,
Kasuta?
Of course, yeah.
So first of all, that's very interesting. I was not aware of that. Although I'm going to give a support for it, but also suggest why it doesn't contradict what I outlined before. I think it is interesting what Yosef has said, because the psukim don't only say roasted, it says al tochlu mimenu na. Correct. So there seems to be an emphasis on it shouldn't be raw, which certainly supports Kasuto, that's part of the idea here. But I think as Yosef hinted, at that point, one could still say, okay, so she just should go through some kind of cooking process. And maybe our commentators will be just answering why tzli was picked over mivushal.
Exactly.
So one could say that there are two levels here. There's a rejection of the raw sacrifices of the Egyptian sacrificial order, but then there's a choice for roasting to convey whatever messages roasting conveys.
Right, which I think it does very much highlight the quickness, right, or something there's something very, as you said, communal about the whole roasting on the pit thing, meaning it still creates that kind of, that culture. And the other piece about, becoming aristocracy, meaning going with that idea, we have this piece where we're raising our consciousness, right? Instead of just saying, now we're free, I would almost say free isn't an identity. It's not an identity, I might argue now, and it's not an identity then, meaning they need to be given some sort of identity. They can envision what nobility looks like. Now, do they really believe their nobility right now? No, but it gives them a picture of something that they're aiming for. I highly doubt that these slaves who have been, freed for approximately 3 minutes, they're really inhabiting the headspace of someone who's free. But they can envision what it looks like to one day get to that space where there can be enough social mobility that they can then also, become something of nobility. And I think that there also is just a very strong reflection here, which we see in so many elements of these halachot, about how our behavior is supposed to reflect back to us something that we're supposed to experience, which might underscore most of halachic observance, meaning if you're going with tamei mitzvot and that there's reasons that we're doing all these things, that we're constantly, I would say we're getting almost a crash course at this first moment, that the things that you do are supposed to reflect back to you the way that you feel. Now, is it always going to be that way? Is that always going to be the correlation between them? Of course not. But in this first moment, I think it's like a very powerful introduction to mitzvah life. It's not just an action. It's an action that's supposed to convey or even sometimes create a reality.
Absolutely. I'm just going to throw one thing in before I respond to that, which is, I imagine it's probably been quoted in this context before, but when you talk about the absence of identity of a free man, I'm forced to think about Isaiah Berlin's famous essay of Two Types of Liberty, where Berlin says there's negative liberty and positive liberty. And negative liberty is that no one restricts you. You can do whatever you want. And positive liberty is that you have a vision of the good life and you're able to overcome the barriers and realize that vision. And without summarizing the entire essay, I think what Yosef is saying is very good in the sense that maybe Yetziat Mitzrayim could have just led to a negative liberty situation. Okay, the Egyptians are not in control, but there's no vision of what we're striving for, of what we're aspiring to. And maybe some of the nobility theme is moving from negative liberty to positive liberty.
Could I just respond before you respond to what I said? I want to just digress for a moment into a topic that I know both you and I have thought about a lot, which is the topic of like recreation. Okay, meaning I think people, first of all, those who know Isaiah Berlin, we can be really impressed if they've read the essay. I've tried to read it many times. It's far less clear than the way that Rabbi Sachs summarizes it. But I assume that many of our listeners, if they know it, it's from Rabbi Sachs. But what I do want to say about that is that we see the pitfalls of the negative liberty when it comes to recreation. That many times when we're free of what we have to do, here's open space. And when people are honest with themselves, they know that very often recreational time is best planned beforehand, meaning it's best to give it some sort of goal, right? Of give it some sort of space that you want to navigate it towards. It's a little bit like, and again, I'm using an example from this past weekend, but my husband and I were just traveling and, we had a plan for Friday, right? We had a plan for the time we had free. Often we find that our time ends up being used better and it doesn't feel like it just slipped away like quicksand when we give it some sort of goal. So I think that that's like a real life space where we often experience in real time the difference between absence of something versus giving it a positive move forward. But you wanted to respond before more to the other piece.
Sure. Although I do like your recreation point. I think I might be getting ahead of this conversation a little bit, but I think this really points to the significance of giving tamei mitzvot. There are different positions in our tradition. Maybe some people prefer, I don't want to think about reasons, I just do it because God said so. And then I think the dominant school of thought, which is to try to explain the rationale. And here I see, I think, a huge advantage of the latter approach, in that if halacha is not just a series of do's and don'ts, but it's intended to convey values and ideals, and as Yosef says, and affect us. So at that point, I think thinking about again, obviously something could affect us without us knowing the reason. But I think it'll be more effective if we have a sense of what we're trying to accomplish. And I'll even say this helps answer a subsequent question we could have, which is, well, we don't have a sacrificial order. So how are we affected today? But I think if we could extrapolate from some of the values, there's no reason why they shouldn't apply absent a sacrificial order. Just use a non-carbon example. There's a prohibition in the Torah not to work your slave too hard. Right, you're a Jewish slave. You shouldn't do
lirdot, which is also a clear play on our experience in Egypt.
Excellent. Yeah. So avodat parach is a problem. Now, thank God none of us have slaves today. So in theory, we could say this is no longer a relevant idea. But the Sefer HaChinuch, again, points out that a lot of bosses have people who work under them.
Yeah.
And very often there's a tremendous power imbalance, and the boss could certainly mistreat the worker in terms of working conditions. And again, I wouldn't say you're formally violating avodat parach or lotir debo b'farach, but you're certainly violating the spirit of that halacha. So I think in terms of your point, it gives us reason to engage in tamei hamitzvot, and also should motivate us to ask, how can we apply these ideals to our contemporary situation?
Right. Okay. So maybe what we're going to keep that in mind as so far we've collected the idea already of that this Korban experience might be pushing us towards envisioning ourselves as nobility. That's sort of a first idea that we've taken from the detail of the Korban, right?
Yes.
Okay. What are some of our other details?
Okay, great. Glad you asked. So there's a couple of interesting things. Let's actually focus for a second on one detail that's unique to Pesach Mitzrayim, and I think it'll be incredibly telling. So if you look at the Mishnah in Pesach, anyone wants to look it up, it's on Daf Tzadi Vav. So there's a list of unique halachot, and one of them is Al HaMashkof Val Shtei HaMezuzot. That clearly in Mitzrayim, they sprinkled blood on the doorposts, which one does not do when one does a Korban Pesach, hundreds of years later. Now, one could give, I admit, a purely technical explanation for this discrepancy.
Oh my God, I have so many non-technical ones.
Okay, great. I'm actually now looking forward. I should speak quickly. Okay, so the one would be they needed to be protected from Makat Bechorot. Yeah. And, when you're doing your Pesach in Yerushalayim, centuries later, the Malach HaMavet is not present, so there's no need. But I think something much deeper is going on, and many contemporary commentators have said this. Basically, you could probably find it anywhere. Rav Yoel Ben-Nun, Rav Bazak, Rav Yoni Grossman, although it does precede them, and that's the idea that we see Zrikat Hadam throughout the sacrificial order, but it is on the Mizbeach, right? You do sprinkle blood on the altar. What would be the conclusion? That the house has been transformed into the Mizbeach, into the Mikdash. And that's why it's the same act of Zrikat Hadam on what is, in context, the holy place, what is the Mikdash. And a lot of other details, by the way, will foster this also. You're not supposed to take the meat out of the house, which also resembles that when you eat a korban, there's restrictions where you can take the meat.
But this is Pesach Mitzrayim.
Yeah, Pesach Mitzrayim.
Okay,
Thank you for bringing
Pesach Mitzrayim.
Right, so Yosef is right. Pesach Mitzrayim is playing out differently, but the guiding spirit that's animating it is the same.
Except that when we're going to have Pesach, then we're going to have to bring it to the Mikdash, the house will not preserve the same identity. Okay. It's almost like in the absence of the Mikdash, your house becomes the Mikdash. They don't even know that yet, by the way, the initial generation.
Right.
Because they've never seen Pesach later on.
Right.
So it's for us, it's even more powerful than it was for them.
Yes. And that's actually a fascinating point, which I need to think about more, which is, what idea am I pushing out here? The idea that the family unit is really the chosen unit to convey the Jewish tradition here.
Yeah.
That it's clearly the focus on bayit. And
I think it's like 7 times in one paragraph.
There you go. Okay, which would fit. I know the people who count words love it when it's 7 times. Getting back to Kasuto.
Obsession with 7.
Okay. Is
or 6.
And you're bad at 7 times?
I believe so,
okay, we'll count afterward.
Yeah.
Okay, so in any case, and I think it's a very powerful idea. How do we convey our values to the next generation? Arguably, it's not on a national level, not an individual level, it's on a family level. That's where people really learn what to identify with and things like that. And this certainly has contemporary resonance. I've often been intrigued why the Seder is so captivating, that when you look at percentages, I don't remember what the percentages are, but both in Israel and America, a really remarkable amount of Jews keep the Seder, whether they're observant or not.
Even though it's one of the harder mitzvot to perform.
Correct.
Yeah, it's like totally counterintuitive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would say, look, there are many factors, but I certainly think the fact that it revolves around the family is a big part of it.
Yeah.
Like the Seder is, Grandpa makes the same joke every year, and here's where Grandma makes her comment, right? That's what the Seder is, and that's a beautiful thing. So I think, so the first thing I'll say before I'll leave with a question a little bit is that, again, the details are taking us to a meaningful place here. Why is it that you sprinkle blood on the doorstep? Why is it that you can't take the meat out of the house in Pesach Mitzrayim? Because the bayit is the holy place. That's where we encounter God. That's where we stand for Judaism, even today. Although it is interesting what Yosef has said, I have to think about this a little bit. When we actually get to a mikdash, and we now do have a holy place with a mizbeach, what role does the bayit still have? So that's something I need to think about a little bit. I mean, I guess the family unit is still signing up for a korban. So I think there is still a family theme, I think.
Yeah, I want to think about a different piece with you, but I think the idea that we'll half mention of the chavura, right? That a group of people have to like sign up basically to be participating in this korban. In reality, most of these chavurot are families. Meaning, in reality, you're going to have you're going to have a few people who are all going to sign up and they're going to be part of a family. But what it also does, which is beautiful, is that it leaves space for people to come and join who aren't part of the family, and then it's like a precursor to kol divchin.
Excellent.
Meaning we have like in the korban mechanism a way that people can join on even if they're not part of the family, and so I think that the idea of doing things in a group is what's preserved in Chazal, even if it's vis-a-vis the mikdash, even if you're not performing it in the home. So I feel like we get to preserve all those pieces.
I'm just going to jump in that for a second. If we already mentioned Rabbi Sachs, one of Rabbi Sachs's major themes is that a problem with Western modernity is that we only really focus on two units. We're really into individual rights and really into the government as, supporting social welfare. And he says so much of a society's fabric is based on smaller groups. Okay, this obviously many people pointed this out, Michael Sandel and Michael Walzer, but the Pesach just works great for Rabbi Sachs's thesis that we're going to convey our traditions through a family, or as Yosef says, a family with added people joining the Chabura. I will also like to add, those of you who are intrigued by what we're doing here, so clearly those commentators who address Tamei HaMitzvot might be the best address. So it's not an accident that the Sefer HaChinuch has already appeared twice. And of course, Rav Hirsch, in his commentary on the Torah, engages very intensively in Tamei HaMitzvot. So he would be a natural address. And he often finds symbolism. I would say sometimes you might feel he's pushing it a little bit, and sometimes it's incredibly enriching.
I just want to pause for a moment and plug Rabbi Blau's course on the VBM. It's on Tamei HaMitzvot, right?
Well, it's on modern rabbinic thinkers.
Oh, okay. I've used it in multiple courses of mine. So plugging that. If anyone doesn't know of our listeners, the VBM, the Yeshivat Har Etzion's website, is an unbelievable archive of so many courses. Many of them are precursors to books that were later published, and some of them remain as online courses. And they do an amazing job of always translating the English into Hebrew material and the Hebrew material into English. And I just want to say, as a teacher, you might think like, people know so much about so many things. No, we don't. We look things up. We go onto websites. The VBM website is one of my first places that I always will just Google. I look up a topic on their archive and find what's there. And Rabbi Blau has a wonderful course on modern rabbinic thinkers. And one of the topics he delves into is how they look into Tamei HaMitzvot or don't look into it. So plug for that. Sorry, continue.
Thank you for the free advertising.
Yes.
Okay, so Rav Hirsch here finds a good deal of symbolism. Now notice, where do we sprinkle blood? Both on the sides of the door and on the top. I think it's called the lintel, if I recall correctly.
I wanted to say that word first.
Sorry.
It's one of my favorite translated words. You know those words, like the Hebrew words, just like you could never ever use them unless you speak about that in English.
That's absolutely true.
Yes, the lintel. I'm so happy it arrived.
No one has used the word lintel in the last 50 years unless they were discussing this chapter.
Exactly. Okay, thank you. Yes.
So in any case, Rav Hirsch says that something really very powerful. What is a house all about? Why is it so significant? So he says two things. One, of course, is it protects us from the elements, right? Rain and snow and heat, and we go inside and we're protected from that. And of course, it is somewhat of a barrier or a protection from the social world. Now, again, it doesn't mean we want to be antisocial, but most people need a break at some point. Most people need to retreat from society, either to just relax, to be with their family, moments of solitude, and the house provides that as well. But then I think those really are the two essential functions of the home. But then the symbolism is really tremendous. Meaning the roof, the lintel, the top part is about being protected from the elements. They come from above, right? That's where the shining sun comes from. That's where the falling rain emerges. So that's that. But the sides are about society, right? Society doesn't drop in from the heavens. They come from the street, which is on the same level. So says Rav Hirsch, here we have exactly all that a house represents. We are sprinkling blood on the aspect of the house that protects you from the cold and sun. And we are also sprinkling blood on the sides, which provide a refuge from society. So in this particular case, I find his symbolism quite meaningful.
Okay, so two thoughts on that. First of all, if I was able to, in terms of the copyright, I would put in the background now Idan Reichel's Ben Kirot Beiti, which is a beautiful song, a little bit more negative, but a beautiful song where he speaks about like the refuge that a home creates for people, but that's a sidebar. But the other piece I wanted to say is also that this is one of my favorite Rav Hirsch's, to be quite honest. I love this. And also that I think that there's always something nice about some little educational tidbits. And I just want to say that I'm not the most creative person on an artistic level, but something that I've been doing for the past few years for Pesach is that on Erev Pesach, I put red albad material, like what's it called? And it's like not felt, but it's, I don't know what that's called in English. Sure. Yeah, albad, clearly. So I decorate the entrance to our home and I put it around the whole doorpost. And on Erev Shvi Shel Pesach, I make the front of our house the entrance to the ocean. So I just want to say that it's really cute. I'm not particularly creative. I don't have that many skills in this department, but it's something that my kids really remember. And so just throwing that out here, and apropos the doorpost, I want to say something else and hope it's not going to make anybody uncomfortable, which is that I think there's another element to the blood on the doorpost. I think that initially most fundamentally, it's most clearly really a mini mizbeach. I think that that's like the foundational image here. But I think that there's another element because the whole experience of leaving Egypt is there's a lot of birth metaphors here. And I will not be the first, and I'm in my mind quoting Ilana Pardes, who's a very intense literary scholar, but has written quite a bit on Tanakh, where we sort of look at the idea that Egypt is kind of the womb from which we emerged. And in that case, we have, but the exit of the home with the blood, and we also emerge from water afterward onto dry land. And there's a very powerful image here of birth that I think is maybe not, these are all images that can sort of exist independently of one another, but I think that that's another important piece that's here as well. I think it also fits with the fact that our whole story begins with the birth, right, of children and then of Moshe and with these midwives. And it's a little bit almost like we are midwiving ourselves out of these Egyptian homes, at least in Egypt in Pesach Mitzrayim. So also wanted to place that here. And I think that there's so many moving pieces to this.
I'll just say in response, so it turns out that it's not 100% true that, red on the doorpost ended in Mitzrayim. One can still find it today in the Rubel home, apparently.
Yeah, that's true. And you know what? We're going away this year, but I'm going to bring my material with me. I saved the fishies from each year. I have them still cut up. I have everything in bags. But yeah, it's a really easy, cheap way. And in general, again, I'm not such a creative person when it comes to artistic things, but there's something fun about doing it. There's so many resources that people have created. This year also, I bought another sort of game. There's just a lot of great, really, really quality things out there. And while I have an endless amount of suggestions in Hebrew, if anybody wants, please reach out and email me and I'm happy to suggest them. But in English, I also just want to mention the name of someone who has been on the podcast actually before, Sari Kapitnikov, That Jewish Moment, and she has unbelievable resources, particularly for Pesach. On her website, many are free and some you order for a very, very low price. So putting that out there for those who want to invest a little bit more creatively in the educational aspects. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another detail. And I think this is a really good one because it looks totally technical and perhaps meaningless. And we'll try to find some meaning. Okay, so another detail that's limited to Pesach Mitzrayim is Mekcho mi be'asor. They would take the animal on the 10th of the month. Yeah. Now, of course, that's several days before they're actually going to do shechita on the animal.
And one wonders, why is there such a need to take it a few days before? And this is not true l'dorot, right?
Yeah.
Again, a couple hundred years later when there's a Beit HaMikdash, as far as I know, you could take it like half a day before. And no need to do it from the 10th. So what is the significance of the 10th? So here I'll do again what I think is a more technical approach as a foil to a more meaningful approach. So the Ibn Ezra just says, Yom Nivchar V'hu Lishilush. It is a third. So for those of you who like mathematical things, well, I guess not exact precision, but you just like math in general. So you might notice that a lot of special days in Judaism are the 10th or the 15th. So if we say that the lunar cycle is roughly 30 days, admittedly roughly, so then it works great. Here we have those who love mathematical precision. Let us have festive days halfway through this cycle and a third of the way through the cycle. Okay, so again, it is interesting, but I don't think it is so, to use a term relevant to Yosef's previous idea, I don't think it's so pregnant with meaning, but maybe there's something else going on. So Rav David Tzvi Hoffman has a fascinating suggestion. What do we often do in these circumstances? We say, do we see this detail somewhere else in our system, and can we then make an extrapolation? So it's hard to deny that if we hear about something unique on the 10th of the month, I think all of us think about Yom Kippur. Like, where else do we have significance on the 10th of the month? And Yom Kippur certainly has a very, very strong focus on atonement. So Rav David Tzvi Hoffman suggests that this was part. Here he says the purpose was double, l'hagain al habayit, right? That practical element before we mentioned protection, v'gam kedei l'chaper, and also to atone. So I just want to highlight two interesting things here. One is we do have a sense in our tradition that Am Yisrael was in a low spiritual state in Egypt. I have to admit, I never find it so much in Shmot proper, but it is in Yechezkel, I believe. So there you do have that sense.
And it's also in Dvarim when we speak about Egypt being a place where we're sort of going through a refinement process, right? The Kor Barzel. Oh, really? That's always how I understood it. Is there another way to understand that? Just people living or dying through it?
Yeah, I guess I always thought just maybe just when you have trouble, like it kind of, and you overcome it, it kind of refines your personality.
Oh, that's beautiful. I thought about it the other way. I always thought it meant that only those who were worthy made it out, and therefore that's the refining.
All right.
Okay, either way, but it's definitely in Yechezkel.
Okay, Yechezkel is quite explicit.
Yes.
So maybe there is a sense that there's an atonement that's necessary.
Yeah.
But I'll go further. One of the things I think is very powerful with the Korban Pesach is that Am Yisrael is finally taking an active role. Like I think we think about the Exodus story, it's almost like we're just spectators. God does everything. Like he brings the Makot, he splits the sea. So where exactly does Am Yisrael show its contribution to this whole endeavor? And arguably that's exactly what the Korban Pesach is all about, that we have to do something that takes courage and conviction, and this will work out well. Maybe along with activating Am Yisrael, there's also a certain taking of responsibility for our lack of spiritual initiative during those years in Egypt. So again, here we have something that seems like a very random detail, the 10th of the month. And Rav David Tzvi Hoffman says, no, for the careful reader, you get a sense of an atoning quality that's part of the Pesach Mitzrayim.
Right, that's really interesting. Yeah, I agree that this idea of them being sinful or low doesn't seem to really come out of the story of Shemot at all. It just seems to be that so many years have passed since they've been connected directly to a tradition. I mean, it's impressive that they know God enough to cry out to him. Years ago, I'm just remembering now we spoke about that actually when we spoke about Tefillah once, but it doesn't seem to be that they're like extremely connected to their Jewish roots. There's something so all-encompassing about this mitzvah that I almost feel like it's like a microcosm of all of the Torah. Think with me for a moment. We have here almost hilchot kashrut, meaning we have isuk with food per se. We have sensitivity to timing of ben arbaim. We have who is allowed to eat this food, meaning like specifics about who's involved in it, meaning there's a lot of delineation of boundaries. We have here, we'll of course have Kohanim, but we're sort of jumping into the fact that this religion is actually going to give agency to the people themselves, and it's not going to be about an external intermediary. And as you said already, we've turned the home into a mini mikdash with rules about also notar, like you can't leave anything over, and all the strictures we have surrounding korbanot that we'll have, including how to cook it. And you're not allowed to cook it with lots of different, spices, meaning you have all these very specific stipulations, and which may be leaving like material culture of Egypt behind, may or may not. And also this commandment about how you're supposed to do it, which goes back to the chipazon piece, meaning the idea that what we do is supposed to create a certain atmosphere. It's a very high level of consciousness that at this point we're kind of used to because we've grown up on it. But it's a very big deal to not only demand to do things, but also in the case of Pesach Mitzrayim, as you said, to command that it be done in a certain atmosphere, meaning this is the clothing you're supposed to wear. You're supposed to be doing it like this. It's almost like a direct sort of throwing Am Yisrael into a Torah observant lifestyle with all the sensitivities. Now, they're actually not there yet. Obviously, they're going to spend generations until they actually create these kinds of sensitivities. Even just getting their hand on the whole monotheism thing is going to take a while. But meaning, like it's a very intense introduction to what I would almost say halachic life. Do you know what I'm saying with that metaphor?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that there's something very, very powerful about that. And sort of it also, again, if you're taking slaves, it also doesn't leave a lot of room for them to have to think so much. Meaning we don't want to they're not right now at a space where they're mature enough to, okay, so bring it around that time. No, here's a very specific time, very specific date. This is what you're allowed to leave over. This is what you're not allowed to leave over. And I feel that it's like, again, throwing them right into this sort of halachic life.
Great. One of the problems of doing a podcast with Yosef is she raises too many interesting points that you want to respond to. But we'll see if I can survive.
I think you're doing okay.
Okay, so number one, I like the contrasting midrashim she cited before in the sense that we have this sense of, they're the 49th level of Tumah. They're really not acting appropriately. And yet this praise of their devotion to Jewish peoplehood. And maybe those two things are not contradictory. Like one could not be so involved in religious ritual, but have a fierce commitment to a national identity. And that would be manifested.
I think we're deeply familiar with that kind of model in the world today.
Yes, with language and dress. So I think that's a pretty important idea. In terms of our other idea about this kind of introduction to halachic lifestyle, so it reminds me of something that I found very striking. We have this famous question that is repeated on Seder night, where the child asks, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem? What is this service? Now, it might be a little bit anachronistic, but a lot of Mefarshim read the question as, we don't understand the halacha as it's playing out here. Such as, why would you shek the karban before the Chag when usually avodah should take place on the Chag? Right? It's odd. Or the Sforno says, on Chagim, we tend to bring communal offerings. Why are we bringing something that might seem more like a karban yachid, right? It is individualized. Now, again, I don't know if these questions are anachronistic or not, but I think it does perhaps help the point a little bit that these details are kind of introducing Am Yisrael, not just to halachic observance, but to halachic thought. Right? How does halacha play out? How should karbano play out? Like, when should they be offered? What should their nature be? So perhaps this is like a double introduction. Like it's an introduction to the practical, experiential element of fulfilling halachic observance, but maybe it's even introduction to almost the Talmud Torah of halachic observance. Let's understand how avodah is meant to work.
Well, I think just to that point, the way that the Haggadah has sort of molded throughout the generations is to recast this experience through the experience of Talmud Torah. Meaning that's what Chazal did in a world absent and devoid of the Mikdash. So I mean, if that's anachronistic, it's anachronistic in the same way that most of the Gemara is adding on a different layer to a world that is no longer their world. So I think that it's certainly relevant to everything that we're experiencing, and we have the Haggadah turns. I mean, that's also famously why it doesn't tell the story through the Psukim and Shmot, because they tell the story. And instead it tells the story through elliptical Psukim that then we read all these drashot about what they're supposed to mean. Meaning the Haggadah and the way it's formulated is to make the Seder retelling a little bit like a Beit Midrash experience. Now, what's interesting is that in people's lived experiences, they often kind of undo this. I hope I'm saying something that's not like too, kfiradik, but meaning a lot of times those drashot they kind of detract us from the story we're trying to tell. And I only once in my life kind of like led a Seder, I'm having air quotes here for those who don't see me, with a whole host of relatives from all different backgrounds. And the wildest thing I said to them was that we don't have to read every single piece, meaning it actually was very wonderful in that particular setting. It was very freeing, and we ended up, I brought some games that we did. Speaking of Sari Kapitnikov's website, it was one time I ever did a Seder in English, and I wanted to make sure that they were present in, let's say, the few minutes I had of their attention in the actual retelling of the story. And I didn't want to get bogged down with the details of how many makot were there. There really were 250. So I think that Chazal casted this experience in the language that was resonant in the way that they were and still develop Yahadut. But I think that many people intuit at their own Seder that sometimes there has to be a give and take between those two kinds of atmospheres. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah. So let me say two things. I think, first of all, I think we've now hit another way to overcome the fact that we don't have a sacrificial order. Like I spoke a little bit before about, let's take the values and ideals that are manifest there and translate them. And secondly, simple study. We connect to something by studying it. Yeah. So when we can't practice it, we learn about it. I think that is certainly another way.
Oh my God, I have to just interrupt you in the middle, because a guest from a while back already was Chaim Seiman. And in his introduction, in the beginning of his book, Halacha, the something of rabbinic law, he says exactly that about Talmud Torah. He says you have so many elements, mitzvot, or different elements of the Gemara that are never meant to be fulfilled in any kind of way. And he basically, his theory there, which is I think one of his biggest contributions in the book, is to say that Talmud Torah becomes a goal in and of itself. Meaning, many times halachot are not actually going to be practiced in real life, but when we recast them as Limud Torah, we give them their own independent purpose. Sorry, I had to just go in there with that. Yeah.
So in this context, I have to quote a source that's not well known enough. It's really interesting. When we're looking at the Talmud, what topic should we focus on? So certainly an argument could be made, and this probably has happened. Oh, let's focus on Moed, Nashim, and Ezekin, which could still be relevant today, and less energy on Zra'im, Kachim, and Tarot, right? Agricultural law outside of Israel is not really practiced, the sacrificial order, and laws of ritual purity. And at that point, I think yeshiva curriculums do tend to focus on the other three. And one can even find this in rabbinic sources. The Chai Adam, obviously a practically minded fellow, he wrote a book of halacha. So he suggests that's where we should put our energies. But less well known, there's a remarkable thing in the introduction to the Be'er Sheva. I think his name was Rav Yisachar Ber Eilenberg, if I recall correctly. In his introduction, he actually says we should precisely for that reason be learning the Masechtot that are not practiced today. Because he says we'd like to connect to the totality of Torah. And we're naturally going to connect to Sukkot and to marriage through the experiential realm. So those we will have a relationship with, but we will have no relationship with a Karban Shlamim or Trumot Masrot unless we study them. So that's really fascinating.
Wasn't that a foundational teaching in the Brisk method, or making that up?
It is interesting. So Brisk does focus on Kudshim, but there are various theories as to why. Okay. So if you look at Rav Moshe Lichtenstein's article, What Hath Brisk Wrought, which was in the Torah Modern Journal, I think volume 9, but you could find it online. So he has some other theories about why. Yosef is right. Brisk was drawn to Kudshim. Yeah. Why they're drawn to Kudshim is something that we could debate.
I also learned that in Chaim Seiman's book. As we sort of wind down our conversation, I just want to reflect back on that earlier question that we had about in a world devoid of korbanot, of our sacrifices, and focusing specifically on the Pesach sacrifice and some of the details that were specifically only fulfilled in the Egypt experience in our first Pesach, that I think we've taken with us a whole host of things and helped me sort of gather them. We've spoken about the idea that perhaps the way that we're eating, whether it's literally by the way we cook it, or perhaps also we didn't talk about the leaning per se, but the heseba, that we're sort of trying to craft who we would like to become in the future. We've spoken about the totality of the experience. We've spoken about the symbolism of the blood on the doorpost, of turning our home, which is of course an eternal idea, of turning our home into the center, our Avodat Hashem, which I'll just footnote here, the challenge of that, right? Because so often it's very difficult to create religious environments within the home. I might be sharing from my personal dilemmas at the moment. It's kind of easier when it's this sterile shul space. We can complain about it, but there's something easier about it. Okay, so we sort of mentioned a little bit some of the creative ideas of how to turn our home into that space. And what are some other details that we saw?
The 10th of the month.
We saw the 10th of the month, right? The date of it, which, by the way, just another really creative idea. I have never done this myself, but I had a student who told me that her mother would take a stuffed animal and would tie it with a rope to the doorpost of her bed. And she would wake up on the 10th of the month.
Amazing.
Every single year with that animal there. Brilliant. Wow. Yeah, I know. I want to do that.
Yeah, so now we've discovered that both the Dam al Mashkov and the Mekho Me Basar still live on.
Exactly. They totally still live on. And this is a great conversation. Thank you so much. And I really feel like it's given us so much to take with us. And while I opened and said that I was going to wait with my introduction to the mitzvah observance series, honestly, today was kind of that introduction. This idea of A, being realistic about where this takes us in our mitzvah observance in our life, and B, the idea that the virtues and the ideas that live behind the details are often what we're trying to get at. Now, to say that we can access them without the doing, I think would be a falsity, meaning most of us need the somatic physical experience to even get us to pay attention to what we're doing. It's a very high level of humanity to just pontificate about an idea. And so I think that if by way of a non-introduction, air quotes again for those who are listening, by way of non-introduction to the book of Vayikra and the conversations that are to come, is this idea exactly that there needs to be some wedding between our behaviors and our thoughts, to anchor them, to give them basis, and of course our thoughts are dynamic and they shift over the generations, and what was resonant in one generation will be resonant in a different one, and we've also touched upon that today. So thank you so much, Rabbi Blau.
My pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to have you on, and Chag Sameach. Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.